I was doing the LA Times crossword puzzle this weekend. Sure enough, what's the answer to one of the questions for the clues? The Dalai Lama. I went with my family to see The Social Network, the movie, last autumn. A bit of dialogue. It mentions the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama's been on The Simpsons, been mentioned on The Simpsons, been mentioned on Frasier, the TV show. You know, this goes back decades. I think the first mention that I recall was probably in 1980, the movie Caddyshack, where the American comedian Bill Murray does a little riff on how he was caddying for the Dalai Lama. And the Dalai Lama didn't, he said, well, how about a tip? And the Dalai Lama says, well, there'll be no tip, but you'll have total consciousness on your deathbed. So, you know, this is all part of popular culture, and you know, he is very widely known in the Western world. I mean, go back probably 15, 20 years, the Dalai Lama was on billboards here in California and across the US for Apple computers in an ad campaign that they had for notable people, including Albert Einstein and the Dalai Lama. As Clay said, I spent 6 years in Beijing, and it was near the end, from 2003 to 2009, and it wasn't until closer to the end of my time there that I took an interest in this subject. I'm not a Buddhist. I'm not a follower of the Dalai Lama. I became intrigued by the topic. And as a result, I made a real effort to go see him as often as I could. I went to Tokyo once because he was offering a press conference. I went to Dharamsala, India, where they have the Tibetan government in exile, twice to see him and to talk to Tibetans and so forth. And I followed him on a tour around the US. So I'd seen him about 20 times in various occasions when I finally had an opportunity to sit down with him face to face. And this occurred in northern India, this hill station of Dharamsala, which is quite a beautiful place. Anyways, so I had this opportunity. He's sitting there. There's several aides there. And I'm told that I would have 45 minutes to speak with him. And 45 minutes rolls by. I have many questions. I'm trying to touch on a lot of topics. An hour rolls by. An hour and 15 minutes rolls by. And I'm beginning to think, hey, don't you have something to do? You know, I mean, talking to me. And he said, no, it's very important for those who are writing about this subject in depth. And at that point, the conversation was evolving to, you know, what's going to happen? You know, you're going to pass away. You're going to be 76 this year in July. And at that point, he says something to me that really surprised me. And I'm going to read it to you because this is very pertinent, as a matter of fact, to what's going on in the world in the last few weeks, even today. He says, I have no sort of assurance, but I feel the 14th Dalai Lama's lifespan may be a little longer than the Chinese Communist Party's lifespan. I think this totalitarian system, 5 years, 10 years, I don't think its present ruthless sort of policy will continue. So I thought that was quite interesting. It's almost like a wager, you know, I'm going to live longer than you. But it was, you know, you could look at it in many ways, but I looked at it in a very concrete, perhaps mundane way, that he was basically saying a one-party authoritarian state has an expiration date. Now, you just have to read the newspapers to see that this is a topic that is definitely worth considering. No one is saying that the Chinese Communist Party is on its last legs or anything of the like. The Dalai Lama may be completely wrong. But that said, we just have to look at what's happening in Tunisia and Egypt, and even today as Muammar Gaddafi is trying to hang on to power in Libya, that there is something to be said for the brittleness of a one-party state that does not always respond to the citizenry. Now, does it matter that the Dalai Lama would say something like this? I think his opinion matters. And why is that? Because, as Clay alluded earlier, some people consider the Dalai Lama now what would be called a universal moral figure, somebody who has risen to the level of Martin Luther King, say, here in the United States, or even of Gandhi in India. Certainly most Chinese would not have that opinion, but I think in a great part of the Western world there's a sense that he may be a very great figure because his talking about interfaith religious harmony and so forth goes beyond, transcends his own Tibetan Buddhism. And there are a lot of people who of course, really desire to hear that. And I'll go into that in a little more depth later. Tibet has perhaps 5.5 million people. I'm talking about the Tibetan plateau, Tibetan exiles, and so forth. It's really not that many people. So the natural question is, why does it matter what happens to the Tibetans? There's certainly, scores of small ethnic groups around the world. And I've reported on them in Latin America, including a small group in Nicaragua where there's only 20 speakers of that language. Of course, this is a problem that's occurring all around. The Tibet issue, though, I argue in the book I wrote, is important because how the ruling party in China treats the Tibetans is emblematic of how it treats those who are weaker or those who potentially may be in opposition to the party. It is a give-no-inch style by the party in dealing with these groups often. So while today it may be the Tibetans, tomorrow it may be the Vietnamese, or it could be the Japanese, and in the future at some point as China rises and becomes a stronger nation, it could be you or I. You probably don't need any background on the Dalai Lama, but let me just, fill out a little bit of what Clay said. The Dalai Lama left for exile in 1959. About 120,000 Tibetans went with him over a period of a year or so, and they left because the Red Army troops had amassed on the Lhasa plain. They'd come in through Sichuan in 1950, and there was a clear sense that it was very important to Mao Zedong to consolidate control over Tibet. Now, there are many points of view about Tibetan's history, and I won't go into that in any great depth because I'm not a scholar of that, but the Chinese claim is basically 700 years of, if not sovereignty, at least a lot of control over what had happened at Tibet, and that China, therefore, was naturally empowered to embrace Tibet into the motherland. To understand the issue of Tibet, it's really important to understand two things: geography and demography. On geography, Tibet is 1/8 of the landmass of China. And it's incredibly important for a number of reasons. Now, Tibetans are far from the only minority group in China, as some of you know. The largest minorities are probably groups that you haven't heard of or are not very familiar with: the Zhuang, the Hui Muslims, the Manchus, those who came, who were descendants of the Manchurian Empire, and so forth. What's important to look at today, though, is the situation of the Tibetans and the Muslim Uyghurs. And the reason for that is because they are culturally, linguistically, and religiously different and unique in many ways. So their battle to preserve their culture and their identity is fundamental in ways that other minorities aren't. So I said that the Tibetans have 1/8 of the landmass of China. To the far west and northwest is the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. That's 1/6 of the landmass of China. Now, if we were to include the area where the Mongols, the Mongolians, traditionally existed, the Inner Mongolia Autonomous Region, we're talking about 42% of the landmass of China. So you can see that for party policymakers, territorial integrity in terms of the minority issue is fundamental. Now, there are a lot of different minorities, 56 ethnic groups in China, but they're not just in the West. They're also, the party is clearly concerned about 2 or 3 million ethnic Koreans along the North Korean border as well. Let me give you a few more examples about why Tibet is important geographically. Headwaters of the 7 mightiest rivers of Asia come from Tibet. Tibet is considered the 3rd pole of the Earth, along with the North and South Pole, because of glaciers there in the Himalayas. It's full of minerals. It's got copper, lead, zinc, and iron ore. And it's a key buffer with India. And that relationship with India is what political scientists and economists call a hot relationship in terms of economics, but a cool one in terms of diplomacy. Trade, two-way trade between India and China has just exploded. 2004, it stood at $13.6 billion. This year, it's likely to hit $60 billion. And by 2015, $100 billion. So the trade is just taking off. And yet at the same time, in terms of diplomacy, the relations are tense. There's border disputes in both the eastern side of the joint border along with the western side. Let me go a little bit into the history of how Beijing has sought to bind areas of ethnic minorities into the bosom of the motherland, as it were. It's used fairly common techniques, and one of them is to build a railway. A second one would be to funnel in investment in a major way to try to lift livelihoods. Thirdly, control religious expression, particularly in those areas where there are minorities who have their own religions. And fourthly, allow migrants to flow in freely, which in effect dilutes culture. Let me give you an example from Xinjiang, Uyghur Autonomous Region in the far west. In 1949, the ethnic Han component of Xinjiang, ethnic Han being the majority, it's 92% of 1.3 billion people in the mainland. The ethnic Han component of Xinjiang was 6%. By now, it's 40%. So there you see that the dilution of the Uyghur population is ongoing. What would it be in Tibet? Well, the figures aren't readily available. It's treated as a somewhat secret issue. People I talk to say that if you go to the capital of Tibet today, it might be as much as 2/3 non-Tibetan. Now, that may not strike you, but just recall that Lhasa was a forbidden city for centuries in which no foreigner could get to, not only because it's prohibitively difficult to arrive there, but also the Tibetans didn't want outsiders. Now, China, of course, as it's risen, has made humongous achievements in many ways. 2003, sending a man into space. 2008, hosting the Beijing Olympics. What they did in Tibet was in 2006, they inaugurated the Sky Train, the first time that Beijing had been linked to Lhasa by rail. This was a huge achievement because it has to go over permafrost in the Himalayas up as high as 16,400 feet. And let me tell you, your head is going to throb at that altitude. The train is sealed. If you have bags of chips, they puff up like a blowfish. You carry pens in your pocket and you look down and you realize the ink is all over everything. You sometimes see people just lying down in the aisle just kind of moaning because it's really hard to deal with that kind of altitude. And they built scores of bridges to go over the permafrost. And it was, I think, without doubt, a huge engineering feat for the Chinese and gave mainlanders great pride. But among other things, what that did was allowed, well, migrants were already flowing into Tibet, but allowed more migrants in. And this has undoubtedly changed the face of Lhasa, the once holy city, to the point that the U.S. State Department, it's gotten a seamy side, and it's also gotten a Chinese veneer that it never had before. One of the people I talked to in researching my book was a woman who's probably the best known Tibetan blogger about the issue of what's going on in the Tibetan plateau. Wei Su is her name. She's quite widely known, partly because she writes in Mandarin. She writes in Chinese, and so obviously a lot of people read her. She said to me at one time, she had lived in Lhasa. She now lives in Beijing. She tries to go back, but she's often not permitted to. She said, when you are there, you cannot have the feeling of being in Lhasa because you walk on Jiangsu Road, visit Taizhou Square, and see Fujian Road and Guangzhou Road. Tibetan nomads, she said, now get lost in the city. They can't read signs in Chinese. Now, a lot of the storefronts, the law says have to have both Chinese and Tibetan script. But the Chinese is often much larger, and sometimes the Tibetan is not even there. One of the things that irritates the Tibetans most is the seamy element of the city. And that could be reflected in the fact that the US State Department, in its annual report on Tibet, says that Lhasa and Shigatse, this #2 city in Tibet, have hundreds of brothels now and as many as 10,000 sex workers, most of them Han Chinese coming up from Sichuan to service a growing population of administrative and military and other Han Chinese that have gone to Tibet. So this once sacred city, now the Tibetans often call it the devil's land rather than the sacred city, just because they're really dismayed by the changes that they see. It's not easy for people like me to go to Tibet, or specialists, say, in places like USC, if you have real knowledge of the Tibetan history and Tibetan issue. You need a permit to go. Now, every foreigner needs a permit to go to Tibet, but for tourists, it's not particularly difficult to get. The Chinese ministry in charge of the permits, though, would check very carefully, and if you do have some knowledge, specialized knowledge of Tibet, it's going to be very difficult to get that permit. It's very difficult, I assure you. I want to take a break for a moment and give you some visual images, sort of touchstones of what I saw in Tibet. There's going to be, it's only 4 minutes long, but there's going to be some video of the riots that broke out in Tibet in March of 2008. And you're going to see that the city of Lhasa was aflame. I mean, there were 300 fires that broke out in the city. 22 people died. Now, in much of the Tibetan plateau, where there were more than 100 other protests over the subsequent 6 weeks or so, only 20% of them were violent, 80% were not violent. But these, the riots that occurred in Lhasa were particularly, were the ones that captured world attention. So let me just roll this for a second. When I went to China in 2003, over the course of the first few months, several years unfolded, I must say that I had two conflicting emotions. One was tremendous awe, and secondly would be real dismay. Let me go a little bit into the awe, because it's just, during that period in particular, and this, I'm talking, 5 years run up to the 2008 Beijing Olympics, it was impossible not to be awestruck by the pace of change. My office, our office, was on the Jianguomenwai, so it's on the main boulevard bisecting Beijing. We lived in a diplomatic compound, and the next building was the office, and it was on the 14th floor. I would go out in the balcony, and one day, just, seeing this unfolding, this speeding up of growth, I counted all the high rises that were under construction within 3 blocks, and it was 13. 13 high rises just within, and I'm talking about half the arc. I'm not talking about what was behind. It's just in front, within 3 blocks. Extraordinary, and it was going at 24 hours a day, working 3 shifts every day. I'd look out, at the rare occasion I'd be in my office 11 at night, I'd look out and see welders working on the upper stories of the building right across the street. It was extraordinary. Now, this pace of change can bring about tremendous development in incredibly short periods of time. Let me give you an example. In the run-up to the Olympics, Beijing the party had to build a 3rd terminal to the international airport in Beijing. So they built not just a terminal, they built the world's biggest building by some estimates. They had to move 9 villages, 10,000 people. They threw as many as 50,000 workers at the project, and they completed it in 3 years, 10 months. Just extraordinary. And the British reporters were having a field day with this, because the discussions about expanding Heathrow had been going on for 20 years. So this was, just a sign of the accomplishments. New subways lines going up. When we got there were only 2 subway lines, and by the time we left, there was 6 or 7. It was extraordinary. This has brought incredible optimism to Chinese in the cities. There's so many stories. I always had an office researcher in my office, and when I first got there, I had an older gentleman who had been assigned by the foreign ministry, Mr. Guo, and he used to disappear into the bathroom of the office every afternoon about 1 and come out and his freshly bathed and combed, and I realized, oh, he's taken a shower, every day in the office, and I realized it was because the office was so much more comfortable than where he lived. Well, within a couple of years, he had moved. The foreign ministry had assigned him a new housing unit, and it was much better and more spacious than it was before. After that, I had an office researcher who was much younger. She was probably just 24 or 23 or so. And one day, she came back from lunch, and she said to me, out of the blue, I was sort of thunderstruck. She said, I was with the office researcher of the Guardian, the British newspaper, she said, at lunch, and we decided someday we're going to be rich. And I said, well, you're going to have an apartment, you're going to have a nice car, what do you mean? No, I'm going to be really rich. And that was within the realm of her possibility as far as she was concerned. And when you think about it, how many people here are born in the mainland? Are there many? It's quite a number of you. All of you look young. You're all younger than 30 for sure. You, from the mainland, have never seen a down economic year. Every year, it's 8, 9, 10%, even 11% economic growth. You have no conception of what it's like to see a slow economic period. That generates huge optimism, huge optimism. Now, in the countryside, it's not the same story. Obviously, you all know that there are reports of tens of thousands of protest disturbances in the countryside, and that's partly because there are grievances over land issues, or grievances over environmental pollution and so forth. Often the village party chiefs or the county party chiefs may be in cahoots with industrial investors or something, and so they take land away at 1/10 of the cost that they eventually sell it for. These disputes are serious, and the parties' insistence that social stability is paramount is because there's great awareness that this could cause a lot of problems. Now, if there's that kind of instability or potential for instability in the countryside, magnify that when we talk about Tibet and Xinjiang. And I keep pulling Xinjiang into this, and you'll see in a minute why. In Tibet, as you saw in the video, there were riots in March 14th of 2008. In 2009, in Urumqi, the capital of Xinjiang province, there were riots that left 200 people dead. And they were, if you saw the video images, they were horrendous. I mean, people, both Han and the Muslim Uyghurs were running through the streets with metal poles and stakes, and it was a situation that could have easily spiraled out of control. Why did these occur? Well, I argue that minorities want the power to determine policies in education, culture, religious practice, and demographic composition, and Beijing won't give it to them. Give an inch on these issues, the party feels, and the minorities may rush to break away or somehow dismember the motherland. One of the policies that I noticed in Tibet as I traveled around researching this book that engendered the most frustration on the Tibetan plateau was the issue of resettlement of Tibetan nomads. Now, this is a policy that ostensibly would have a lot of benefits. By taking nomads from these thousands of small villages and putting them in larger communities, you can provide them with better health care, better schools, and you can give them sturdier houses. But what is unsaid in this policy is that you can also have greater political control. And something even more fundamental that I found as I went to talk to nomads is that the lowly yak is the lifeblood of many Tibetan nomads. They use the hair from the yak to sew rugs, to make their felt tents, and so forth. They use the milk from the yaks for butter, for cheese. They eat the yak meat. It's just, I mean, to take away the yak from the nomad is to virtually change the culture really sort of beyond belief. Now, there's arguments that there's grassland degradation. There's no doubt that 20% of the Tibetan plateau has now been, the grass is unusable for herding. But there's a lot of reasons for why that may occur, and the Tibetans deeply disbelieve the government argument that it's caused by them, because they've been existing on there for thousands of years. Let me turn to the broader issue of the gulf between Tibetans and party officials in the language they use, how much disagreement there is on just the whole gamut of issues. Let me give you an example. What is Tibet? If you ask party policymakers, they'll talk about the Tibetan Autonomous Region. Talk to Tibetan exiles, they'll talk about an idea of Greater Tibet, which is twice the size of the Tibetan Autonomous Region. And it's really indisputable that there are as many Tibetans living outside the Tibetan Autonomous Region as within it. So what is autonomy? The party says there's full autonomy now already in Tibet, because the point to actually the gentleman that was shown in the video, say he is a high-ranking Tibetan official controlling matters there. But in fact, it's always the Han Party Secretary General who really calls the shots. Now, one of the things that you notice living in China is the derisive tone that's often used towards the Dalai Lama. The party clearly despises him and calls him a criminal separatist. And various party leaders have used even stronger language. One called him a devil with a human face, but the heart of a beast. Another said he was a wolf in sheep's clothing. Basically, I think Clay alluded to this as well, the party is waiting for him to die. He'll be 76 this year. He's fairly healthy, but how long is he going to be around? A decade, decade and a half, maybe 2 decades, but in fact, I mean, he's in the twilight of his life. This kind of language to us in the West, at least the majority, I don't want to generalize too much, is jarring. As Clay mentioned, he won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1989. He fills arenas. After his fellow Peace Prize laureate, Desmond Tutu, was awestruck once when he appeared with the Dalai Lama in a stadium in Seattle, and he said, 50,000 people, and he said, the guy doesn't even speak English well. And he can draw a crowd like this. It's really rather extraordinary, especially considering that he's from a village in Qinghai province, and he's taken his background as a Buddhist monk and really transcended the issue of Buddhism and the issue of his Tibetan nature. He's really a worldwide phenomenon. I argue that he's more widely known than anyone else alive who was born in what is contemporary mainland China. More widely known than Jackie Chan, I think. More widely known than Yao Ming. Now, it's hard to measure this. I really searched a lot to see if there was anybody who had actually done polling in multiple countries, but I think the case can be made. Now, if this language is jarring to us, to Tibetans, it's really blasphemous. I mean, it is blasphemous because they consider him an emanation of the Buddha himself. They venerate him as a god king. And so the fact that the party prohibits his photograph is just, for them, it's just very difficult to bear. Many Tibetans maintain his photograph, they hide it, there are raids on their homes, the photographs are destroyed, but they obtain new ones. For Tibetans, they'll throw themselves on the floor in his presence when they are able to go abroad in prostration. They call him simply Kundun, the presence, because that's the way they feel about his magnetism. This frightens the Chinese leaders, and that is why they haven't let him set foot back in his homeland. So what is it that scares the party about the Dalai Lama? I think this is a very important question to ask. It's several things that he represents. A desire for religious freedom, a sense that material fulfillment is not enough. And of course, his ability to reach and mobilize, well, I don't know if mobilize is the right word, but to reach tens of millions of people around the world. If you don't think these are powerful factors for the party, I ask you to think back to that morning in April 1999 when members of the Falun Gong sect that had just arisen tremendously in China in the late 1990s, when 10,000 people appeared outside Zhongnanhai, and the party leaders apparently were not aware that this was going to occur. This was a frightening thing for the party, to have this occur so suddenly, and it clamped down very hard. It declared Falun Gong an evil sect, and within a couple of years, the group had basically been dismantled and quashed. So the natural question is, what will happen now? The Dalai Lama, as I said, he's going to be 76. The party will clearly name a replacement. It has arrogated to itself the power of deciding Tibetan Buddhist reincarnation, which is rather interesting because it's originally an atheist party is now entering into an esoteric sphere. But it doesn't argue this on religious grounds, it argues it on nationalist grounds. It says that it is doing this to prevent outside interference in a possible reincarnation. So, as it's done with the number 2 figure in Tibetan Buddhism, the Panchen Lama, it will certainly find its own lad and create a Chinese Dalai Lama, if it were. And this may not happen for a few years, and the Dalai Lama has been rather coy about what he himself will do. He's said it's up to Tibetans to decide whether the institution of the Dalai Lama is worth saving. He's only said that if there is a reincarnation, it will occur outside of the borders of China. It will be in what he calls a free land. Could be India, could be anywhere. He says it might be a girl this time. Now, of course, Dalai Lama's Tibetan tradition is always that it be a male, but he said, I've heard him say this, maybe it could be a girl this time. He said that maybe Tibetan Lamas should create something like the College of Cardinals that the Roman Catholic Church uses and elect a new leader. Now, of course, this would go against tradition, but he's basically saying anything goes. Let's wait and see. And people press him on this, but he feels that he's going to live quite a while longer and has not. He's named a few people that he says are very charismatic, possible leaders, but he doesn't say possible new Dalai Lamas. Now, let me go to my final point, again, returning to the issue of why this issue is important. I've just outlined what may occur in the future. A faux Dalai Lama, as it were, filled with patriotism for the motherland. But here's the deal. If China can't accommodate this very basic issue of the Tibetans to be able to choose their own religious leader, and it does so with a give-no-inch approach, why will it accommodate others, more important groups, other nation states? I don't want to say that the Tibetan issue is a litmus test, but I will say it's one of many benchmarks that is important for nations like the United States to watch, to see how China behaves in the world. Certainly there are other benchmarks such as cooperation on global security arrangements, environmental policies, human rights, and continued sustained economic growth. What is going to happen on this issue? The Buddhists, of course, say that everything is impermanent. Things will change. On the other hand, Tibet may slowly and inexorably slide closer into Beijing's embrace and may be an erosion of the culture. No one knows for sure. We'll all just have to wait and see how this unfolds.